Hi, I'm Lawrence D. Mass, Larry Mass, and I want to offer some introductory comments on my book on the future of Wagnerism, a sequel to my memoir, Confessions of a Jewish Wagnerite. Virtually everyone in the worlds of music, art, and culture, and especially opera, are familiar with the controversies surrounding composer Richard Wagner. These controversies are not new, and though they can seem ever more serious in light of historical research and findings, there never has been, nor will there ever be, a simple formula for resolving the great art, bad man conundrum of Wagner appreciation. While everyone now knows about Wagner, anti-Semitism, Hitler, and Nazism, the operas remain bedrock for the art and culture of Western civilization. Always, and more notably than with any other cohort of Wagnerism, this has left Jews scrambling with denialism, rationalization, accommodation, and internalization of anti-Semitism. As the worst of this history recedes in time, accommodations to Wagner and Wagnerism have grown ever more resourceful and challenging. Now boldly incorporating the history of anti-Semitism, Hitler, and Nazism in deconstructive stagings, they tacitly ask if it's not time to loosen our concerns and qualifiers so we can get back to the greater endeavor of Wagner appreciation. Is it not time to move on from what one ardent non-Jewish Wagnerite and leading music critic capturing his own frustration and what he doubtless accurately perceives to be that of many of his colleagues, calls the Nazi rut? For someone who writes as critically of Wagner as I now do, it might seem surprising that I admit to not having more certainty about the future of Wagnerism or the direction it should take. So if the world already acknowledges these controversies and I have no magic answers, no certain solutions, why have I written these books, Confessions of a Jewish Wagnerite and its sequel, On the Future of Wagnerism? That is something I do feel I can now answer. To recap, if the seriousness of Wagner's anti-Semitism and its fallout for Hitler and Nazism is now widely acknowledged, and many Jews have already expressed themselves about this and made what most regard as reasonable accommodations around this issue, why does my story still need to be told? Simply put, the reason is that it's the story, the narrative of my own personal journey, that I, as a human being and as a writer, physician, person in recovery, gay man, and Jew, have felt most deeply impelled to write. My drive to do so is perhaps best understood with an analogy. In 2021, and for the first time in its history, the Metropolitan Opera commissioned and in fact opened its season with a work by a Black composer. Fire Shut Up in My Bones by Terence Blanchard is based on a memoir by New York Times writer Charles Blow. I must confess that there were aspects of this story that left me feeling uneasy, as it must have others. Blow and Blanchard tell the story of the young Charles who, as an adolescent, was molested by a close relative. Not only did it not deal primarily either with race or with gayness, it seemed to flirt with the old mythology that childhood seduction can cause homosexuality. Seeing the opera did not allay these concerns, but they were superseded for me by a greater realization captured in the title of the book, an opera, Fire Shut Up in My Bones. Think about that. What that title says very clearly, and what the work in fact conveys, is that what Blow had done was write the story that he, as a writer and human being, most needed to tell, his own personal story. Because it was a story that was never politically correct and that no one seemed to want to hear, much less validate, that very personal story was literally a fire shut up in his bones. That, I became deeply aware, is what I had done and why. My story of being a Jewish Wagnerite was a fire shut up in my bones that had to be released. It may not be politically correct. It may go against expectations of how Jews have been or should be in relation to Wagner art and society, and as such, it may be something that few will want to acknowledge, claim as their own, or otherwise deal with. If you were to canvass Black opinion about Blanchard and Blow and their opera, there would likely be considerable, if respectful, issue-taking with regard to the Black experience it portrays. To be sure, it was a pinnacle achievement of operatic and Black history and culture that the Met did this work, and between the lines of Blow's story, much about Black experience can be gleaned. But should that high accolade have gone to the odd and very personal story of a gawky kid whose sexuality seemed to have had its origins in family trauma? The personal story of a Black kid whose biggest demons and enemies weren't white racism? Blow said that none of his family members attended the opera's premiere. Indeed, it will be interesting to see how future arbiters and custodians of Black culture designate this work beyond its prestige of coming out in the halls of white culture. Similarly, my tale of codependent relationships, especially those with my siblings and as reflected in my relationship to Wagner, is not one many Jews or many family members would be inclined to validate. Most Jewish experience with Wagner has not been nearly so messy, troubled, or personal. Yes, there was Otto Weininger, an extreme exemplar of Jewish and gay self-hatred, but if Gustav Mahler or even Leonard Bernstein, both of whom I write about, were to somehow have read my story, I think they might have evinced reactions comparable to those of Blow's family. While they might acknowledge conflict and touchstones of identification, mine is not a story they, or virtually any Jews I know of, would claim as theirs or as otherwise representative. Just as Charles Blow had to live with his own inability to find the right way to express himself for readers who could appreciate his narrative and viewpoint, I had to find a way to express myself on a subject that still seems deeply troubled and which has deeply affected my life. Based on my own experience of indifference and rejection, it's a story I sense few want to hear or read, a story few want to take seriously or even acknowledge. Another story that had to be told was that of the German artist Gerhard Richter, whose work became the subject of Never Look Away, a book and a 2018 film by Florian von Donnersmarck. The story he had to tell via his cryptic paintings was of the horror of his personal experience of Nazi atrocities and of the East German communist totalitarian afflictions that followed. It's the story of losing his beloved aunt, who was schizophrenic, to Nazi eugenics, and later becoming intimately involved with the daughter of a leading Nazi gynecologist who survived the Nazi defeat to practice his eugenics under the communists and explicitly against his own daughter and the child she was carrying with Richter. While my own involvement with the Nazi-oid gynecologist differed in particulars, it was of the same ilk of horror of my gradually realizing what I had been privy to and my need to find the means to divulge that story. Eventually, via my love of another Jew, I finally awoke to the reality of my intoxicated codependent relationship with this Nazi-oid gynecologist and with others, and as well with Richard Wagner. Because I had fallen so deeply in love with Wagner, who I would sometimes describe as my first great love, it was like awakening to realize I had been romantically involved with a vampire or serial killer. What must it have been like for their victims, many of whom were romantically drawn to the charismatic men they later came to know as their enslavers, torturers, and murderers? What must those moments of realization of truth have been like for the lovers of Dracula or Ted Bundy? That narrative of my emerging awareness and sobriety regarding Richard Wagner, of my coming to see that the first great love of my life was a key figure in the genocide of my people, is the story I've had to tell. And with the life or death urgency and desperation, for me, of a Charles Blow or Gerhard Richter. And what is the trajectory of that story, of my story? When all is said and done, my narrative is the saga of someone who, beyond acceptance and even forgiveness, was never able to reconcile his love of Wagner with Wagner's hatred for him. Thank you.